Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program one of my favorite guests that we haven't talked to now in a number of years, and that's renowned anthropologist Jack Weatherford. In 2004, Jack Weatherford published his iconic book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. He has written about the history of Mongolia for more than 2 decades now, and the Mongolian Empire, which may be one of the largest empires of all world history. We will talk about that. He's also written extensively, especially early on, about other histories outside of Mongolia, including his book, which is one of my favorites, The History of Money. We had him on this show to talk about the history of money. He also authored the book, Indian Givers, How the Indians of the Americas Transformed the World. I read that book in college when I was taking a course on the history of Mesoamerica at San Francisco State University. Jack Weatherford is out with a new book that he joins us to talk about. It's called Emperor of the Seas, Kublai Khan, and the Making of China. Jack Weatherford, you're joining me from Cambodia.
Yes, I am. So you and I have been together many times in many places, but I thought you'd forgotten about me. It's been a while. I'm so happy to be back with the Pacifica family again.
Never forgotten about you. I can't forget about you because our interviews were very impactful for me. I hope I don't embarrass you here, but when I first talked to you, it was about the history of money, and this was during the Great Recession, just the years after the housing bubble burst in this country. And I remember I picked up Lapham's Quarterly that was published by the great Lewis Lapham, who regrettably recently passed away. And you had an article in there. I think it was called, this is all off the top of my head, but I think it was called Prometheus Unbound or something like that. And it floored me because I that was the first time I really ever dived into even ancient history and saw why even ancient history mattered and told us things about what's important to understand just about life and civilization and all of these things. And then we talked about that. And to be honest, Jack, I have a whole collection now of shows that we have done. My listeners will know this. You may not, but my listeners will know.
Yes.
We have a whole collection of shows that we have done on ancient history. But it began with that one, the one that we did on the history of money. And so this is a real treat for me to have you back.
Well, thank you. I'm greatly honored. But we can learn from any era in history. We can learn from any era. There are always lessons there for us.
And you know, Jack, I was just looking at your bibliography of the books that you've written, and if I'm getting this wrong, you'll correct me. But it looks to me as though you've really been focusing on Mongolia for maybe the past little more than the past 2 decades. Before that, you wrote about a whole host of, including about the history of money, several books on indigenous cultures of the Americas. How did you go from writing about indigenous cultures of America to becoming someone who would win some of Mongolia's highest awards for the work that you have done on the history of that country?
Well, you know, my interest was in tribal people and their role in world history, not just as victims, but I always wanted to see what they had contributed to the world or the impact that they had for good or bad, not just to see them the way we so often do as just having been run over and steamrolled out of history. And so I was doing that with the native peoples of North and South America. And then I wanted to look at a place where the tribal people had won, so to speak. And that's how I first started off with looking at I was going to look at the tribes along the Silk Route, especially all the Turkic groups primarily. But I got to Mongolia. That was the first stop. And I just fell in love with that country. It was in 1998. And I'm still there. My life is very much focused on it. But this is the last book, though, Mitch. 4 books. And I got to give room for somebody else to have a say. But I've been so fascinated with that history.
Tell me more about the fascination with the Silk Route and tribal people and how that all comes together.
Well, we think about the Silk Road, of course, connecting, say, Europe or the Middle East with China, several great centers of civilization. But along the way, it was the tribal people who handled. They lived in the oases and the deserts, and they were the ones who were primarily conducting the actual trade. And so that was the book I started out to write and to research. But I gradually changed, and it became just a book about the Mongol world and the Mongol creation of the empire. And then one thing led to another, and now here it is, what is this, 25, 26 years later or something, and I'm still working on them, but it's just got to end. It's got to end. We need young people. Like you say, you read my first book when you were in college.
Yeah.
That really dates me.
Yeah. I did read it in college. And I remember it because it was important. It was, and in fact, whenever we have you on, I'll hear people will write to me, Jack, and talk about other books that you have written that they've read that were important. Oh,
that's so nice.
There's something about Mongolia. I want to start with this, and I want to start with you talk about this a lot in your book latest, The Emperor of the Seas, about Kublai Khan and the making of China. But you also find this in your other books of Mongolia, and I think this is important to know about, and that's called The Secret History of the Mongols. What is that?
Yes, Genghis Khan did not allow anything to be written about him in his lifetime. No images painted or sculpted, and nothing built to honor him, no temple or tomb, nothing. He was very, very secretive about that. But as soon as he died, within 2 years, then his sort of stepbrother or stepson, you can look at it either way, he had adopted from the Tatar people, named Shigi Hutuk. Shigi Hutuk began to compile the history. And first it was the myths of the Mongols from ancient times, and then the genealogy, and then all these little personal stories. But it was only meant for people within the royal family because Genghis Khan had outlawed this. And so for a long time, only members of that family could read it. And so it became known as the secret history of the Mongols. Then later, after the Mongol Empire fell, then the Chinese actually put the book together in a manuscript form, the Ming Dynasty, which was then lost until the 19th century. It was found again. So for me, it's very valuable because it's the Mongolian perspective, not just the people they fought and the people who lost against them, but it's what the Mongols had to say. And there's so many details in there, particularly about the life of Genghis Khan, nowhere else. That he killed his brother, for example, his half-brother. That's nowhere else in any source in the world, but it became very evident that it was completely true. It's also in there about the times he cried, which the other sources, of course, don't include that. So it was very important for me. For this new book on Kublai Khan, it's much less important because Kublai Khan was not born until 1215, which was already well into the life of Genghis Khan. And so far as we know, Genghis Khan only met him once, which was kind of interesting. He was about 9 years old, Kublai Khan was, and Genghis Khan met him just after his first successful hunt with his older brother, Mongol Khan. And Genghis Khan said, "You don't look like a Mongol. You look like your mother's people." So it was a very interesting, I think, start, and I'm sure it had an impact on Kublai Khan.
Was there, with the history of Mongolia and the Mongolian Empire, was it also significant that because Mongolia was also part of the Soviet Union? Wasn't that also sort of significant in being able to access the history of the country?
Yes. Mongolia was the first Soviet satellite. It was not included as one of the republics within it, but it was a satellite occupied by the Soviet Union until the 1990s. And during that time, they suppressed everything with Genghis Khan. And in fact, they killed off every known descendant of him, which would be the same as saying they killed off the aristocrats, because the aristocratic families from the old clans claimed descent from him. So it was a brutal, truly a brutal persecution of anything to do with him. And even when the prime minister Temuratur at one point in the 60s, he issued a couple of stamps, or tried to, and they took him away and chopped him up with an axe.
So were Genghis Khan's descendants still ruling Mongolia up to when it became part of the Soviet Union?
No, they were not ruling, because they were being ruled at that time by after China. They were being ruled by a lama who was from Tibet. So they had to always come each time from Tibet. So it was like a divine king. But the families were still powerful within the various tribes. They were called the aristocrats of the various tribes within Mongolia.
The reason I'm bringing all this up is, again, because I'm trying to think of what you have done in Mongolia and telling the history of the Mongolian Empire. In that it seems significant. You have the fall of the Soviet Union, and now you have access to this information again. And this is sort of you sounds like you get there. You said 1998, not long after the fall of the Soviet Union, and start doing your own research and writing about this history. My understanding, you'll correct anything I say that's wrong, but my understanding is the book that you wrote about the Mongolian queens of the empire. I think these were the daughters of Genghis Khan. You sort of resurfaced their name, helped resurface their names again, and then people started naming their daughters after these queens.
Yes, that's a great point of pride for me, that actually, in a way, in Mongolia, the book on the queen sold better than the book on Genghis Khan. And that's the only country where it sold better. And I was very pleased with that, yes, because there was a story that was cut out of the secret history. And when I was studying the secret history, I think I maybe discussed this with you before, that I got to a certain sections. They're all numbered. So section 215, I got there and it was only a fraction of a sentence. And that it was, now let us reward our daughters. It wasn't quite that complete, but that was, and most of the translators had translated it as, and now let us marry off our daughters. No, it was let us reward our daughters. And so it was very clear to me that somebody cut that story out. You're going along and then suddenly it's just gone. And I tried to recreate as much as I could. It was just a first effort, and I really hope in the future we'll have a lot more research to bring these extremely powerful and interesting women back into the known history of the world.
Women played a vital role. I mean, they always do, right? But a very overt, obvious, vital role in the Mongolian Empire.
Yes. When not only were they very strong in the time of Genghis Khan himself, but all of his sons went off to war with him. But he had to leave somebody in charge. And so these were always women. In the case of Mongolia itself, then he had 4 wives. The 4 wives were administering Mongolia itself. But then in the neighboring areas, which were mostly like Turkic areas, he assigned those to his daughters. And he did that also by marrying them to the leader, or marrying the leader of the group to them. But he made it very clear in his wedding speech to them that he was giving those people to her to rule, and that the husband had to go with him to war while she ruled back then. So the women were extremely important. And then he also made excellent marriages for each of his 4 sons. And then when his son Agudai Khan became the great Khan after Genghis Khan died, then on his death, his wife Dorjin, she ruled for 6 years. She ruled the largest empire in the history of the world. Her name is practically unknown today, and she was very well respected at that time, except by some of the Muslim commentators. They criticized her heavily. But for the most part, she was heavily respected by people.
Give me her name again. I don't want that to go by too quickly.
Okay. Torojin, which in that time T and D were the same. So I would say T-O-R E-G-E-N-E. But you can write it with a D also. Torojin or Dorojin.
And she was the head of the largest empire of the world.
Yes, she ruled the empire, the Mongol Empire, for 6 years after the death of her husband. In fact, even before Agudai Khan died, she was more or less in charge. And she did a lot of great things. She supported all kinds of religions. and she had a peaceful time. Those were 6 peaceful years that were quickly ended when after she died.
The focus of your latest book, Emperor of the Seas, is about Kublai Khan and also about China, and I want to talk about both of those.
Yes.
Tell me about Kublai. What's important to know about Kublai Khan? And I ask that as many people now know the name Kublai Khan because there was that series on Netflix. Did you see that series?
No, I did not. I did. What was that? The Marco Polo series?
Marco Polo series, yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, I did not. I do actually. I know there was one Mongolian actor who played the younger brother, Arikbukh, and I do know him, but I did not see it. You know, I'll be honest, I don't like to see films so much because I'm afraid they will get in my mind and I will think it's true when it turns out it was just something in a movie.
Yeah.
So
we won't get your opinion on that. We won't get your opinion on the Netflix series. It was wildly popular.
Yes, I remember that. I heard a lot about it.
What's important to know about Kublai Khan?
Well, I think that he is probably the most famous of all the emperors of China. So he's not just the great Han of the Mongol Empire. He's also the ruler of China. But what's truly important about him is he united China fairly much in the form that we see it today. It was a little bit larger, actually, than what we see today. But it had never been so large to include such things as Tibet, for example, and Yunnan in the south, and all of Manchuria. And he did this. In order to do it, he had to become very un-Mongol. That's because the South Song Dynasty down below the Yangtze River, they were well protected, what they called a Great Wall of Water. That was the river and the ocean. And they had a fleet of ships on the river and along the coast to guard it. And they felt extremely confident that especially no Mongol was going to be able to breach that wall. The Mongols at that time, they could not swim. I mean, they had no interest in the water. They mostly crossed rivers in the winter when they were frozen. And you can see when the Mongols reached a place where the river did not freeze, such as the Indus River, they just never got quite across it. That's where the empire ended. So you get up to the Danube River on one side and to the Indus on the other and all. So the Mongols really had no experience. And the Southern Song, where they were overly confident, but he built a navy. And it was not a protective, passive navy. It was going to be an active, offensive navy. The navy of the South Song was defensive, just to keep people away. The way they did that was often they chained the boats together in a literal wall. But Kublai Khan, for the Mongol, anything that moves can be a weapon, anything. And so they knew how to make these ships move and make them into weapons, or he developed that knowledge.
And so this was a key part of the Mongolian Empire once these ships, because these are people from the steppes, right? The steppes are sort of long, grassy, hilly areas.
Yes, and they, as I said, they don't even know how to swim at that time, and they would. When they came to a river, if they actually had to cross it when it was not frozen, they mostly did so on inflated goat skins. They did not even use wooden rafts. It's a strange thing in the Mongolian culture, and that is carts belonged to women, and they were made of wood, and the women managed them. And the men rode horses. If they ever had to guide a cart, they would guide it from their horse, riding along, holding the reins, or they would walk next to it and guide it. But they would not ride on the cart. That was women's world. And this was a division. And then they saw a boat as being just a floating cart. And so they mostly they would rather ride on the goat skin than get on a wooden boat.
Wow.
So he had a lot to overcome. Kublai Khan had a lot to change in the mentality of his own people and in his own mentality.
How does Kublai Khan become the leader of the Mongolian Empire?
Well, it was very doubtful that he would ever have much of an important role. His father was the fourth youngest son, or the youngest son of Genghis Khan, the fourth son of Genghis Khan. And he himself was not the firstborn, he was the second-born son. And he just didn't have the disposition of a Mongol, really. And I think his mother, who was a very great woman, Sultani, she recognized that. Her other sons were warlike, riding horses, going off to war. But Kublai Khan, there was something different, and she brought in tutors of all sorts for him, Chinese tutors and Buddhist tutors and Arab or Muslim tutors. And she was training him, I think, to be a bureaucrat, to rule over northern China, which was her territory at that time, northern China. And then she helped her eldest son, Meng Han, to claim the throne as the Great Han. And then when he died, all of a sudden at war, then Kublai Khan was off. He'd been assigned to a battle along the Yangtze River, and he was down there, and he was just continuing. And I think it was his wife, Chabi, because she started sending messages to him. Your younger brother, Arik Buk, he's back there in Mongolia, and he's preparing to become the great emperor, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. She said, forget about the Yangtze River. The South Sung will be there for a long time. You can go down there later and handle them. But now you should come back and fight for the office. And I can't say what it was, but something about this inspired him to really strive. And he became a different person. And he did go to war against his brother Arik Buk. And Arik Buk had all the support of all the Mongols virtually. But Kublai Khan had the support of China, northern China. He had the resources, the huge army. He had things that Arik Buk did not have, and Arik Buk was soon out of food because they were so dependent on northern China for food. And then if you saw the movie, I do know that it showed a battle between Arik Buk and Kublai Khan. That did not happen. Those two never fought. However, Arik Buk did surrender. And then within 2 years, he was, as so often happened in Mongolian history, he was mysteriously dead.
You're not the only. You're not the only historian I know who refuses to watch movies about the time of their expertise. You mentioned it's because of the Mongolian and Kublai Khan would form what would become known as the Yuan Dynasty.
Oh yes, Yuan. He named it Yuan.
Forgive me, Yuan Dynasty.
Yes.
And you said that this would give the modern formation what we would recognize as being China today. Of course, China is in itself an ancient civilization that existed thousands of years in some form before the Mongolians arrived. Tell me about China and the Mongolians arrived in the 13th century. Tell me about China before the Mongolians arrived and then after.
Yeah, China was mostly far smaller in the northern part of China. It was always based up there. And then from time to time, tribes from the north, even before the Mongols, we had other tribes, the Kitai, and then later the Liao and the Jin Dynasty, all of these, they would come in and conquer. And so what had happened was the Song Dynasty was one of the truly great dynasties that was formed in 960. And it was a great dynasty in every regard. It was mighty, it was strong, it was productive and all. But they were defeated by the Jin from Manchuria and pushed south of the Yangtze River. And that's the first time that Chinese civilization had to move itself to the south. And then when the Mongols came in and they not only took the north, and they also took the west, but they also eventually, then through the Navy, Kublai Khan took South China. And when he did that, especially around 1276 to 79, then he had unified China in much the way it is today. He even then he had trouble controlling Mongolia because so many of his own relatives were not loyal to him.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Jack Weatherford. Jack Weatherford is the author of the book, Emperor of the Seas, Kublai Khan, and the Making of China. Is this where we get paper money?
Oh, yes, it was already in use before Kublai Khan, but it was a much more limited use. Kublai Khan realized the great importance of it for financing all the things he wanted to do. And so he instituted a much larger system of paper money. And he demanded that more and more people use it instead of using coins. Now, at this time, his older brother had conquered Iraq, Iran, Syria, that area, what was called the Ilkhanate. They are the only part of the empire that stayed loyal to him. The Russian part, Central Asian part, most of Mongolian part, they were not loyal, but they were still in the Ilkhanate, based out of Tabriz, what is it, modern Iran. And he actually even introduced the paper money there. It did not work. The Chinese were accustomed to paper money and they accepted it. The Muslims had never heard of it. And the fact that it had Chinese characters on it and had these symbols of the devil and all kinds of things that they didn't like, they rejected it. But he expanded the use tremendously. And Marco Polo wrote extensively about that. He was very impressed how you could turn paper into gold.
And what effect did it have, using paper money?
Well, it brought everybody into a money economy within China, pretty much. People were using the paper money for all kinds of even everyday market transactions. So that was important, and it gave a certain vitality to the entire system. Now, unfortunately, as with most paper money systems in the world, then and now, governments always overdo it. They get used to, first it starts off all based on silver, we can redeem it. People get used to it, and then the government gets used to this easy money, and the next thing you know, they're printing a little bit too much, and then a little bit more too much, and then much too much. And so it does get eaten away through inflation.
And that happened in China?
It did. It happened under the Mongols. Yes, it did.
Did it was that part of the collapse?
I think it was more of a symptom of the collapse than a cause of it, but it certainly had a major role to play. Whether a symptom or cause, would take a long time to quite figure out.
In the heyday, though, and when paper money is bringing this vitality to China, do we see things that then are connected to it? Is there a flourishing of the arts or architecture, or just things we would point to say, yeah, this is what we get from the Yuan Dynasty?
I'd say not so much in the traditional Chinese things such as art, architecture, calligraphy. That was not so interesting. However, the Mongols did use a lot of it for the support of religious institutions and educational institutions. They were very much behind that. And an odd thing about it is drama. They really appreciated drama. It had not been very important in Chinese history prior to the Mongols. It was considered sort of common entertainment for the people in the markets, and jugglers and acrobats and people singing but it wasn't considered important. But under the Mongols, drama became a new and very important part of Chinese history, and it has remained that way.
There's a tension, isn't there, between the Mongols and the Chinese? And I say that in the sense of the Chinese have a tradition that's really based in the philosophy of Confucius.
Yes.
Ancestry is very important to the Chinese.
Yes.
Just sort of knowing what your proper role in society is important in a Confucius construction, where the Mongols sort of eschewed all of that kind of stuff.
Yes. Starting with Genghis Khan, first of all, he wouldn't accept Confucianism as a religion. He liked Taoism and he supported Taoism, but he said, what do the Confucianists do? They don't even have a god. They don't help cure people, and the Taoists at least claimed to be curing people with all of their just sort of magic cures and all. So he supported that, and the Taoists became extremely powerful in the early years of the Mongol Empire. And then by the time we get to Kublai Khan's elder brother Mongol Khan, they realized they had to do something to break their power. And so Mongol Khan, he assigned this task first to his youngest brother, Arik Buk. And Arik Buk was a hothead. He was a real Mongol. And so he brought in all these people, Taoists and Buddhists and others, for a big conference. And then he got very mad and he picked up a statue and he beat the Taoist representative to death. So then Monk said, okay, we move this issue to Kublai Khan. He can handle it better. So he was working on that well before he became emperor. And he switched over to a greater emphasis on Confucianism and also Buddhism as a way to counter without having to kill off the Taoists. And so that became very important in the way that he was running. But he never truly supported the Confucianists in the traditional Chinese way. Later, some of the Mongol emperors did during their dynasty, but he did not. He was always held them a little bit at bay.
I mean, when you have an empire and you're ruled from someone from the outside, eventually those rulers start to resemble more and more like the people they rule, right? Sort of a normal.
Yes. And Kublai Khan, he tried to keep both. You know, he had two capitals. He had a winter capital, which was at modern Beijing, and that was very Chinese, and the buildings were Chinese. And then he had a summer capital in Inner Mongolia, which was called Shangdu or Xanadu. We called it Xanadu. And he tried to lead both lives. It was a little bit hard, and sometimes we don't know exactly where his heart was, but he was trying to accommodate Chinese civilization. He recognized many of the great assets of Chinese civilization, and his own Mongols were often against it. And that's one reason he did not have much support from the Mongols back in Mongolia or in Central Asia. They were quite against his efforts to Sinicize the empire. And there were some aspects that just could not be agreed upon. And part of it, for example, the Mongols, when a Mongol died, his wife always married his brothers or other members of the family. And the Chinese saw that as incestuous. They did not like that. There were things like that separated them forever.
I'm intrigued by what you were referring to as the Taoist power early on, and I want to know and I understand that Taoism has different strains to it. You have sort of an alchemy attempts to be immortal and live forever Taoism, and then you have your more philosophical Taoism. I mean, I think of the ancient Taoist philosopher Chuang-Tzu, who said that he who leads the less leads the best, or something like that. Was against power. What does Taoist power look like in early China at this time?
Well, Genghis Khan liked them, I think, because in some ways they were a little bit closer to the animist traditions with their spirits and the land. That was very important. Land and the waters and the mountains. These were things that he could identify with, even though he was not a Taoist. But he gave the Taoist charge to manage all the religions within northern China during his lifetime. And unfortunately, what they began to do was then to take over some of the other monasteries, especially from Buddhists, but sometimes from Confucianists also, other temples, other properties, sometimes compelling people to convert. And he gave them a tax-free status. And one of the things they began to do then is confer a priesthood upon all kinds of people who wanted a tax-free status. So you had literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people not paying taxes because they were nominally now Taoists. Well, it was causing a great problem. By the time you get to the grandson, Mongol Khan, he recognized it had to end. It had to end. Their power was almost rivaling that of the Mongols within China. The Mongols had weakened the army in the north of China. They had weakened the Confucianist bureaucracy, but they had allowed the Taoists to flourish.
Well, what's the Mongol aim with the empire? Is it just, I'm assuming it's just like with any empire, it's just for power and seeing how great, and ambition, seeing how great you can actually be?
Now, Mitch, that's a long and delicate issue that I can only really just sort of speculate some things about once you get to motivation. I do believe early on with Genghis Khan, he had no intention of making an empire. He was raiding China to get stuff and to help his people. They were very poor in Mongolia. And then once he had conquered them, he said, what do you do? And he didn't want to set up a government. He was very reluctant to do those things. But gradually over time, he began to get the idea or develop the idea that he had a mission from heaven to conquer the world. He was so successful in it, conquering more area than anybody had ever conquered in history. Someone such as Alexander the Great conquered perhaps 1/4 that amount. And so he began to see it as a mission, as so many wars are, to bring peace to the world. It's amazing to me how even today, in a modern time, we're always bringing peace by killing somebody, But he began to get this true vision of the Mongol people as blessed by heaven and is supposed to unite the world. And that became his mission later on. But he was very clear that he wanted to conquer the whole world. And upon his deathbed, that was still the orders that he gave to his sons, to continue the war and conquer all the rest of the world that was out there.
And this was Kublai Khan's objective?
Kublai Khan was continuing it. However, he was having a lot more problems with his own Mongols more than anyone else. He was quite successful in China, but he had a lot of problems with them. But he created such a big, strong, and powerful China with his great navy that when he died in 1294, and then his grandson Timur took over. Timur is not well respected in the history, but I respect him a great deal because he made peace with everyone. He sent out delegations and said there would be no more Mongol wars, no more, unless you attacked us or fought us. And so all the Mongol groups, not only in Iran and Iraq, the Ilkhanate, but Central Asia, what they call the Chagatai, and also the Golden Horde of Russia, they all swore allegiance to him, and so did many, many other countries. So for a short time, the empire really was a very large world empire. But then soon after that, it began to fall apart.
As you know, Genghis Khan is oftentimes remembered as being one of the most brutal leaders in world history. Some estimate that as many as 60 million people died because of his rule, and that might have been something like 10% of the entire world population at that time. Places like Persia in this time were decimated in population, and other areas as well. And I know this is something you push back somewhat against. I know you don't deny the brutality of it,
yes,
but that you do push back kind of our usual notion of it. But every time I talk about Mongolia and the empire, I do get emails from people saying this is the biggest mass murderer in history, Genghis Khan. How would you compare in that sense Genghis Khan to Kublai Khan?
They did have a different philosophy about war. But first, in defense of Genghis Khan, whom I always want to defend, I think the numbers were much lower. But yes, he was a conqueror. Many people died. But he had a very simple system, and that is, if he was going to attack a city, he gave them the option to surrender, and they would be protected. Everybody protected, all their property protected. And if they fought against him, then he would usually kill off the elite and often kill off the army because the army had been ineffective. And then he would save anybody who had any practical work, any kind of craft. If you could read and write, if you could weave, if you could make pottery, all these people were protected. But he didn't have enough administrators to leave them, especially this is true, as you said, in Iran, the Persian world. He didn't have enough administrators there with him. His daughters were already throughout the Silk Route. And so he would move on, and if they revolted, he came back and killed everyone. That is true. But this is not so different from other times, and I do not think that he was any more violent than most leaders of that time and most conquerors in history. You can go all the way up to the United States, and I mean, we were more than willing to kill civilians with atomic bombs in Japan in order to save our soldiers. And that's pretty much the sort of attitude that Genghis Khan had. Kublai Khan changed that. He no longer did the massacres. He would welcome the people. So when he conquered the South Sung, he did not kill the emperor. The emperor was only a child of 7, or the dowager empress who was ruling. He took them to Beijing. He gave each of them a palace. He gave them a new title. It was a sort of imprisoned luxury. But he was making it very, very clear that this was a new Mongol Empire where we didn't kill off everyone after we conquered them. He was trying to attract in more people. And it was working fairly much because the Southern Song people became fairly loyal to him.
Do you think, is this about historiography in the sense of telling the history? Is there a reason why then we see Genghis Khan as being more brutal than almost any other figure in history?
Well, I think it's part Genghis Khan's fault. He promoted this image of himself, and he allowed, especially the Muslim, the Arab, and the Persian commentators, he allowed them to publish these huge numbers of the people killed. So they would say like 3 million were, well, there was no city in the world of 3 million, none. But they would put it in there. And so part of it's his own fault. He used this propaganda. And also, even, as I said, when he would wipe out a city, he always spared a certain number of them to send as refugees, because they were the ones who would carry the word forward. And also they would carry pestilence, and they would eat up the food, and they would get to the next city, and they would cause great chaos and make it easier when the Mongols came in. So Genghis Khan actually promoted that.
The Mongolian interest in East and Southeast Asia does not end with China. We also have Korea as a part of this story. Vietnam is a part of this story. In fact, I was really fascinated reading about Vietnam, because when they were resisting the Mongols' entry into Vietnam, they were. It sounded like they were doing sort of the guerrilla type warfare antics that you would associate with the Vietnam War in the United States in the 1960s.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. 1258 was the first attempt to invade. It was then called Dai Viet, northern Vietnam, was the first attempt, and the Mongols failed miserably. And in part because they did not understand really about the use of water. They met along the Red River in the northern part. The Mongols came down from Yunnan. They had just conquered that in 1256. And they came down under a very good commander, Uriankadai, and his son Aju. And they got to the river, and they didn't know what to do exactly. But the Vietnamese had come up the river, and they had brought elephants with them, and they had all this equipment. And the Mongols developed a very good plan. And that was, okay, we're going to send a detachment over to burn the boats so they cannot escape. And we're going to use fire arrows to fire at the feet of the elephants and make them panic and stampede. And the plan was good. The problem was the Mongols, they're not interested in boats. You can tell them, go burn the boat. No, the war starts, they're all coming in to fight. They want the flaming arrows. They want to get in there and fight. And so they left the boats there. Well, they shot the flaming arrows. Flaming arrows panicked the elephants. They stampeded. The northern Vietnamese were defeated, but they all raced to their boats. They escaped, and they got back home. It was a tremendous loss for the Mongols. Over and over, the Mongols would win a battle, and they'd lost the war. They still lost the war. They took what's now Hanoi. They took the capital, but it had nothing in it. The people had taken out all the food. And so after a couple of days, they had to leave the city and then make their way slowly back up to China. And then they tried another whole series of invasions in the 1280s under Kublai Khan. And this time coming down by ocean, to come by ship, come down by land. And Kublai Khan sent his own son in charge of it. And they failed. They failed.
Do they ever succeed in Vietnam?
No, they did succeed in making peace with Vietnam eventually. They did not conquer Vietnam. They did not.
I have always heard, though I haven't done my own deep dive into this, so I guess I'll just ask you, that Vietnam has a long history of being colonized by outside forces. The French before the Vietnam War, and before that China for many, many, many years. So is there a connection here?
China ruled northern Vietnam episodically. It is true. But for the most part, this Dai Viet, the northern Vietnam, they were closely affiliated with China culturally. They used the Chinese written language, for example. They used Confucian ideas. They're very closely related. And when the Song Dynasty was losing, many of them fled to Vietnam, especially to northern Vietnam, because it was the closest civilization to them that was somewhat familiar. But soon it became too much, and the North Vietnamese couldn't take in all of them. Central Vietnam and southern Vietnam, however, were not ruled by these outsiders. Southern Vietnam, the most southern part, had been ruled by the Khmer Empire, Cambodia, and Champa, the central area, was sometimes ruled by Cambodia, but mostly independent.
Other places that would have to be ruled by sea include Korea and Japan. Japan, the Mongols also failed. Is that correct?
Correct. They failed in Japan. That was a sea invasion. 2 times Kublai Khan tried it. He failed. He did have Korea. He had very good relations with Korea. The Mongols did not allow intermarriage except for the royal family of Korea and some of the Turkic royal families of the small Turkic kingdom, of the tribal kingdoms. They did not allow intermarriage with other people. So with Korea, they had a very close relationship for a long time. And the Koreans were instrumental in building the ships to help invade Japan. But at both times it failed.
I've heard, and I think you've said, even in this interview, but I've heard it said specifically Mongolia, the Mongolian Empire, to be exact, was the largest continuous empire in history.
Yes, and certainly the largest land empire ever in history. The only rival that you could see later, and it wasn't so much a land, was the naval empire of Great Britain, of England. I kind of contest that because the membership kept changing. You know, the United States was in it for a while, or the Americas, and then Canada was there. Then later, India was added. It was back and forth, and often they were controlling coastal areas more. But if you looked at the whole size with a lot of water in there, that would have been a larger one. However, the Mongol Empire is the largest land empire in the history of the world. No other people have ever conquered China and Russia, not to mention also Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Hungary. They came all the way up into Poland to the edge of Germany. This was the largest land empire in the world.
Do you still find influences, say, like in Poland or Russia, or in these other places that you see as you do in China?
In Russia, you do see a lot of the influences, even in how they structured their government, even their word for ministry today, yam, and many other things. Yes, that was important. With Poland, no. They did not really hold Poland for a long time. They fought a battle there around Krakow. They won. But by the time you get into Poland, you're getting so far away, and once the steppe ends, once the plains begin to end, the Mongols lose interest in these places. So they did not make an effort to hold that. They had Ukraine and then what we call Russia today, all of Russia today, all the way through Siberia. and all, and they had a major impact there.
What brought and when did the Mongolian Empire collapse?
I think a reasonable date to use is just 1368, because that's the time that the Yuan Dynasty fell, and the Mongols packed up and went back to Mongolia after having ruled there for 150 years. The Yuan Dynasty was only 98 years, but the Mongols had been occupying northern China for 150 years. And then it continued on in bits and pieces. It continued on for some while with the Golden Horde, ever getting smaller and weaker, also in all throughout Central Asia. And then it fell in the Ilkhanate about the same time it fell in China. So it was starting to fall apart there. But 1368, I think, is a good date to use for the end of the empire, although bits and pieces lasted. In fact, all the way to the 20th century, some bits and pieces were still there.
Until the Soviet Union?
Yes, all the way, even in China, some of the oasis cities were still ruled by the Mongol descendants, all the way up until the time of the communist takeover.
Why is it that when we talk about great civilizations and empires of past, we rarely begin or even have at the top of the list or even near the top of the list Mongolia? We usually have Rome, Greece, the British Empire. I mean, there's obviously Western biases here when I talk about those. But even if we talk about the Persian Empire, or even, the ancient Mesopotamian empires, we're probably likely to bring up first.
Yes. We're very oriented towards people who are sedentary and they build things, and so we judge them often by what they built. And then sometimes by other things such as the arts and by the technology that they had. And the Mongols, they built nothing of any interest to us. They didn't build any Great Wall, for example. They didn't have a Colosseum, anything like that. They did build roads. They were very good with that. They built a relay system that was very important. And then they often endowed religious institutions, but they didn't usually build them themselves. They also had no technology of any importance. You look at the Mongols, they didn't even know how to make pottery. They didn't weave cloth. They just pounded things together. They didn't do metallurgy. And they were reasonably proud of that. But what's unique about them, and I think sets them apart and above other civilizations to some extent, was their ability to take things from anywhere, because they had no great commitment to one kind of technology, to one kind of art, to one kind of anything. And they would take it from all over the world and put it together in unusual ways. And that's how they were able to create a world empire as opposed to just a regional empire, the way most of the ones prior to that had been.
They had no one commitment to ideology or religion.
Correct. They believed in religious freedom. They granted that to everyone. And it wasn't just to the religion, but to every person. This was a unique. Every person had the right to choose their own religion under the Mongols. And that's something that greatly impressed Thomas Jefferson. He was an avid reader of the biography by the Frenchman Petit de la Croix, and he bought a lot of copies. There's one still in the University of Virginia that he gave. There's one still in the Library of Congress, the original collection that he gave, and one that he gave to his granddaughter. He was a great supporter of this, especially this idea about religious freedom.
Jack Weatherford has been our guest. Again, Jack Weatherford is the author of the book, Emperor of the Seas, Kublai Khan, and the Making of China. Jack Weatherford, it has been a great pleasure, sir, to chat with you again. I know it's late where you are in Cambodia. I think it's like midnight your time.
Exactly.
So I'm deeply appreciative of you, sir, for doing this with us again.
Well, I never want to miss an opportunity to talk with you, Mitch. So thank you so very much.